you.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. I'll start again. Welcome to the annual debate on the eve of Open House Dublin. The purpose of this event is to discuss a topic that is resonant of its time, and past debate titles have been Dublin has changed for the better, does size matter, what kind of city do you want, and tonight's title, Dublin's Fair City. All the other titles are prompting the necessity to foreground pressing issues, and Open House Dublin is the best platform to do that. Open House is a festival that celebrates great architecture and urban design and the people that contribute to the creation of Built Dublin. We do it because by inspiring and empowering people with knowledge around the impact of quality design in the built environment, we hope that we ensure Dublin improves and always improves for the better. As you know, Open House in its usual format opens buildings and private homes to hundreds of people that congregate every year. The format is impossible at the moment because of the times we're living in. It was never a question of not doing it. We just needed to do it differently. Because our perceptions of internal and external spaces have become more profound and heightened. If ever there was a time to do Open House, this is the time. I want to thank our Open House Dublin sponsors and partners who rallied around to support this event. They are Dublin City Council, the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, our new corporate partners, CISCs, contractors, and our sponsors, BAM, CBRE, Dublin Port Company, Dunleary Rathdown County Council, IRAS REIT, Quintain, and our 17 Corporate Circle members. They are an outstanding collection of companies and agencies who are passionate about the built environment and endorse the work that we do. Also, can I thank the programme participants, the architects, the writers, the historians, the filmmakers, the advocates, the partner organisations, building owners who helped us generate the content this year. Also, thank you to the Arts Council, the OPW and the Built Heritage Unit of the Department for your ongoing support of the IEF since the beginning. And last but not least, I appreciate my board for your groundwork and reinforcement, and especially the IEF team for delivering so exceptionally under challenging circumstances, especially Karen Lee Walpole, the Open House manager, and also Gillian Clark, Alva McElwain, Anne-Marie Ahern, Glohin Quinn, and Bernadine Carroll. And now I'd like to introduce our chair for this evening, Dr. Philip Crowe. He is Assistant Professor in Climate Responsive Design in UCD School of Architecture and also the UCD School of Civil Engineering. Philip is co-founder of the UCD Centre for Irish Towns and Transdisciplinary Centre for Research and Collaboration. He is also co-founder of Space Engagers, a social enterprise that uses research, citizen engagement and co-design processes to make our towns and cities more resilient and sustainable. And before I hand over to Philip, can I just let you all know that you have opportunities to ask questions to our panellists, and Philip will moderate those questions at the end of the presentations. You can go to slido.com, which should be on the screen below, on the screen in the lower third of my screen as we go through this event. And the code that you enter is G620. So I hope you enjoy the event, and I'll see you at the Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Open House Dublin Big Debate 2020. As Natalie has said, this year's event is obviously physically adapted to the ongoing COVID restrictions through a rather radically altered spatial configuration, where we've retreated to 2 dimensions and little boxes. But this evening, we're actually going beyond simply adapting to COVID restrictions to putting the pandemic centre stage. Before we start, it is important to acknowledge at the outset that COVID-19 is first and foremost a public health crisis and a tragedy that is devastating lives, families and communities, and that the containment response continues to disrupt and often cripple the social and economic systems that make up what Patrick Geddes referred to as the labyrinthine civic complex of the city. But COVID is also a lens through which to view the city, bringing into sharper focus the myriad challenges that exist, throwing a light on communities and systems already under pressure. As Fintan O'Toole put it in the Irish Times at the end of last month, plagues heighten perception, shake us out of our habits of mind. What was I muted? Throwing a light on communities and systems already under pressure. So Fintan O'Toole put it in the Irish Times at the end of last month. Plagues heighten perception, shake us out of our habits of mind, make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. The pandemic is proving to be a driver of change. The response to the pandemic has demonstrated or strengthened the case for new ways of doing things, including interventions into the public space and the housing system. Rowan Moore stated in the Observer newspaper back in May that a virus can change city planning all by itself, but it can be used as a chance to push changes whose time has come. So health as a driver of change in the city it's not a new concept. If we travel back in time just over a century, we would find a Dublin where the Women's National Health Association of Ireland was helping to clear inner city vacant sites to create playgrounds, bringing sunlight and fresher air to the most vulnerable in society to help fight the scourge of TB. We'd find a city where the middle classes had all but abandoned the city centre and moved out to the leafy suburbs. We'd find a city where a departmental inquiry reported on the housing conditions of the working class, and a civic survey was initiated, and also an international Dublin town planning competition was launched. And then some years later, partly as a result of those activities, the garden suburbs of public housing at Marino and Crumlin and Cabra, etc., were built in an attempt to provide a more healthy, beautiful and equitable city. Health was a key driver in the emergence of Irish planning over a century ago. So for this debate, we're focusing the COVID lens, as it were, onto fairness. And by fairness, we mean two things. Qualities such as equity, diversity, democracy and participation, which are the key pillars of Professor Susan Feinstein's Just City, and also a city that embodies beauty, as well as serving the basic needs of humanity, providing access, health and well-being for all into the future. So the debate is basically asking, if we now see things more clearly through this COVID lens, is it an opportunity for a recalibration of what and who we value, and a rethink of how we design a fairer city for everyone? In order to approach such an eye-wateringly huge proposition, we are going to hear 6 diverse perspectives from an interdisciplinary panel, all of whom are keen observers of life and the city, and who are passionate about and committed to the ongoing development and improvement of Dublin. So each panelist is going to speak for just 5 minutes. And once everyone is finished, there'll be a Q&A session that I will initiate, channeling my inner Miriam, but we will then also bring in questions from the audience. Now, I just want to say that this format doesn't allow us to actually see one another or interact in the normal way as if we were in the same room. And we're not on Zoom either. So this won't be a debate in the sense of a Trump-Biden chaotic battle. So I hope this is not a disappointment. It will be very structured. I will urge you throughout this evening's event, as Natalie says, like a broken record, to please use Slido. This is a way for you to engage with the event. There will be guidance on your screens. You simply go to slido.com, you put in the code, which is G620, and it would be helpful if you could indicate to whom your question is addressed. And if you could keep the question short and clear and keep it to the issues that have been presented this evening. So I should get on with introducing the first panellist. And the first panellist is Dublin's first citizen, Lord Mayor Councillor Hazel Chu. So I'm going to give a very short introduction for each presenter and then hand over the screen to them. So just as an introduction to Councillor Hazel Chu, she is the 352nd Lord Mayor of Dublin and the 9th woman to be elected to the position. And she was elected on the 29th of June this year, so right in the middle of the pandemic and the lockdown. Councillor Chu first became involved in politics in 2014 and in 2019 topped the poll with an impressive 4,000 first preference votes in the Pembroke ward, which I'm actually in at the moment. She studied politics and history in UCD and trained to be a barrister at the King's Inns. And in her spare time, which I have no idea how she has any spare time, but she lends her voice to promoting diversity and equality, and she is a regular media contributor. So if I could hand the screen over to you, Lord Mayor. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Philip. Hi, everyone. I'm really quite disappointed when Philip said it won't be like Trump and Biden. Like, how will we all be entertained this evening? I thank you for the lovely introduction and thank you for the invite here tonight. It is quite unusual platforms we're doing debates on at the moment, but nonetheless, it's actually really lovely to connect with people and to have some shared ideas on what can we make Dublin into and what can we make a fairer city of it. So, and to Philip's point, it is an opportunity because from COVID and the tragedy and the challenges, there is very much a light being shone on the issues we have when it comes to Dublin and how planning works and how the overall city has worked. Your other panelists who have more experience than me when it comes to planning or architecture will probably delve into the issues that we have when it comes to overall Dublin planning. What I want to look at was the issue of integration and social inclusion. I don't have any slides for you, mainly because it's very ad hoc. I guess I take from kind of past experiences and stories from people on social inclusion and integration and look at what works and what doesn't work. And also look at how, in light of COVID, that is affecting people at the moment, that piece, the integration piece or lack thereof. So we would have, and I guess first I'll bring you to the models of the states where currently, there's a little bit of, when currently different areas in New York where I lived is a lot more integrated. But when you go back to 100 years ago, there would have been pockets. So you have pockets of Little Italy, you have pockets of Chinatown, you have Queens, which is which would have a lot of Irish people, and you will see that in different cities that don't integrate well from the beginning. But now New York is a lot more inclusive and integrated. But then you look at another model that I live in was Sydney, where with lack of social inclusion and in a proper integration strategy, what has happened is that a lot of vulnerable minorities would actually be pushed out to areas like Parramatta. And this comes back to my point of, for a fairer city, especially a livable city, you need to have a proper integration policy and structure that rings true not just in the day-to-day, but in how we live. And that comes down to the fact that public land needs to be for public housing. And we need a increase of public housing and public housing in this country, in Dublin, in this city. And the reason for that is it is the best. If you look at models like UK, Exeter is a great example when it comes to public housing and how inclusion has worked in that, because what you will find is that the different groups that are vulnerable, be it from background, be it from ethnicity, be it from religion, any of those groups that couldn't afford housing fit into the public housing model and was able to afford within this model, and therefore you had better cross, I guess, group of people living in the area. So it wasn't that the case that you have different sections where this is the affluent here and this is kind of the vulnerable here. It was a cross section of different societies living in particular areas. This is why the Vienna model of affordable housing works really well as well. So because again, it comes to a threshold of 3,300 or less a month that you fit into, and then you are paying €600 a week, which means if you could well be someone that's a lot more comfortable and live there, or you could be a family that's second generation immigrants that could be living there. The diversity then happens and the integration happens. Oh, is that okay? Hello? Sorry. Oh, I don't know what happened there. Sorry. Integration then happens. Otherwise, you will have, what will happen is a lot of diverse communities stick to their own. I've constantly had people say to me that when it comes to discrimination, that a lot of groups bring it on themselves because they don't integrate properly or they don't try to be part of the community. In some cases, it's people's fears of being part of the communities, but it's also the lack of opportunity because, again, it's a lack of affordable housing in a community. It's a lack of community structures that's being able to be there. And I look at this from a housing perspective all the time, mainly because I'm on the housing SPC. And I can see that even in groups in housing areas where we do try to integrate with people, oh, I have 4 minutes left? I thought that was like 1 minute.
1 minute.
Sorry. Okay, backwards. And I see this on Housing SPC. We hear of stories of one family from a minority background moving into a certain area. People don't like it because they see them as different. And my aim and what I would ask that from a city perspective is that we try to plan it, that integration is one of the first things that happen, mainly because then you don't have people being chased out of areas. And also you have a proper then strategy that combats racism as well, because for a community to get behind the idea of being anti-discrimination is more powerful than just posters or marketing campaigns or anything, because if people know that certain people or people living within your community are those people you protect because they're part of your community, then it becomes a very powerful message. And so from, I think, the top down and bottom up, one of the things we really need to look at for Dublin to be a fairer city is our integration strategy that works within housing, works within our overall policy, and works through all that we do. Thanks.
Thanks a million, Lord Mayor. Housing and social integration are absolutely vital issues, obviously, when it comes to a fairer city, and it's great to get your insight on that and experience living in different places. I'm going to move on quickly because we are tight for time. Our next panelist is Professor Jenny McElwain. Jenny is a professor of botany, or the professor of botany at Trinity College, Dublin School of Natural Sciences, where she is head of botany and director of Trinity College Botanic Garden. Professor McElwain's research and teaching focuses on the evolution of atmospheric composition and climate change over deep geological time and the interactions between plants, atmosphere, and climate. Her research addresses fundamental questions, therefore, in plant sciences, such as how future climate change will impact the survival of plant species, their functioning and distribution. So she's looking to the past to understand how the future might turn out. Professor McElwain is currently chair of the Royal Irish Academy Committee on Climate Change and Environmental Science. So Jenny, I'm going to hand the screen over to you for your 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Philip. Welcome everybody. It's an absolute honour to be invited to be part of this debate. If I could have my first slide, please. So I'm going to view this 5 minutes through the lens of being a scientist and being a botanist. And my first slide here is taken on Westmoreland Street. And what I want to do is to play you a sound clip in a minute. You'll first of all hear the city today, then there'll be a gap. Then you'll hear the city, an aspirational city in 10 years' time. Then there'll be a short gap. And then you will hear an aspirational city, Dublin, by the year 2050, when it is our ambition as a country to be climate neutral. And what you will hear is the results of policies that increase biodiversity in our city and that quieten sound for all people through greater adoption of electric vehicles and electric public transport. So if we could play the sound clip, please, first. It was slightly compressed due to technology, but what I hope you heard there was a transition from the diesel and the petrol vehicle with little biodiversity to greater adoption of electric cars and then greater integration of biodiversity into the city. So I'm thinking of what is a fair city from the perspective of the senses. And looking at this image, the first thing I see as a botanist is obviously the tree. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So this is a beautiful art piece by the artist Siobhan MacDonald, and she did an artist in residency in Trinity. And she views trees as the lungs of the city. And these are the two beloved Oregon maple trees that came down most likely due to a combination of disease and climate change, crashing down 2 years ago. And you can see that if you turn this image upside down, the trees are like lungs. And we know that urban trees are hugely important. They act as lungs. They actually filter out particulate matter from the city's atmosphere. So for me, fairness is a city not only where you have a quiet ambient sound all over, but you also have, obviously, healthy air. And Philip talked about that in his introduction, that cities were planned around health. So next slide, please. So this isn't a view of the stars. Actually, I'm not sure which is your left and your right, whether it's the same as me. So on your left, where there's more bright white, this is an image of a leaf surface taken from O'Connell Street, and the white charging particles are particulate matter, which measure to 10 microns each. Now, on the right-hand side, you'll see that there's very few of those particulates. And a team of my undergraduate students last summer went out all over, well, actually the summer before COVID, measured how trees can absorb particulates out of the atmosphere, and they actually quantified it. So a tree in O'Connell Street is recording 900 particulates per millimetre squared. A tree in Clonliffe Road is adsorbing onto its leaf surface just 200 particulates. So there you can see it visually. Urban trees clean the atmosphere. They're our lungs of the city. So next slide, please. So in the botany department in Trinity, we responded very much to lockdown and to COVID by embracing, thanks Philip, so by embracing the fact that people were restricted to a 2-kilometre radius, and that many people were becoming more engaged with nature. And there's a lot of leading ecologists. We recognise that we're undergoing a biodiversity crisis, but what's equally important is we're undergoing an extinction of nature experience. So it's really important that people, and that we academics and we people provide the knowledge of the weeds in the urban environment and educate people about what they are and their value. So we put out this short documentary series on plants in urban spaces. Next slide, please. So this brings me to nature-based solutions. And I'll just finish quickly here. Nature-based solutions are using biodiversity in a very positive way to address some of the key crises we have currently in the world and also in our cities. One, an extinction of diversity, and the second one is climate change. And I think there's many people working together, so a fair city in the future would integrate these nature-based solutions to address these twin challenges. We have the technology, we have the know-how, we just have to implement it. So thank you very much. That's me done.
Great. Thanks a million, Jenny. We're certainly on a journey. We've gone from social inclusion to biodiversity, and our next panelist is going to take us, well, we'll see where she takes us. Our next panelist is Ali Grehan, who is the city architect in Dublin City Council since 2008, and she leads a multidisciplinary teams responsible for developing a broad urban design agenda for Dublin City. Ali devised and coordinated Dublin's bid for the World Design Capital in 2014, and that has evolved into the design promotion platform Pivot Dublin. And I understand that, Ali, you are currently undertaking a Master's in Climate Change, Policy, Media and Society at DCU at the moment. So if the technology allows us, I'm going to hand the screen over to Ali.
Is it working?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, Philip. Hope everybody can hear me loud and clear. We had some technical glitches. Okay. When I was asked to take part in this debate by Natalie, and she said the question was going to be, is Dublin a fair city? I thought, oh my God, that just reminds me so much of the first time and the only other time I've taken part in an open house debate, and that was back in 2008, and I just become city architect. And the question was, has Dublin changed for the better? And if many of you will remember what it was like in 2008, we hadn't quite realised what was ahead of us. And Dublin had been through a period of huge change and huge growth. And certainly in the public sector, where I worked, we were challenged to emulate the private sector, particularly when it came to housing. Next slide, please. And so what I said at that debate, lots of people said many interesting things. What I said was I thought that the city wasn't necessarily changing for the better, that despite all the big changes and the big moves, that we were really struggling to get the ordinary fabric of the city right, and the ordinary places. And so we all know what happened after that. We all know what happened after the crash, and we're not going to dwell on that. But for a few years after 2008, 2009, 10, 11, 12, it seemed like we were very open to experimentation and new thinking. And then the recovery started to take hold. And I do think, though, there's a big question as to whether that recovery has been fair for everybody, and if we have actually reached a point where we're a fair city, really, to Philip's question. Next slide, please. Cities are really difficult to get right. I mean, people say that cities are wicked problems. And what that means is that they face complex challenges, and where the solution isn't immediately apparent, and you only really figure out the solution once you've actually arrived at the solution. And there are lots and lots of unintended consequences to solutions. So I think it's fair to say Dublin is certainly a wicked problem. And in order for Dublin to become a fair city, we have to reconcile so many urban policy areas. You can see the examples on my slide. Everything from buildings to waste to energy to green spaces to smart platforms, food, community infrastructure, transport. All these different issues all have to be reconciled. And I suppose under the governance structure we have at the moment. And I suppose the one thing is Dublin City Council would not be responsible for all of those areas. So we have to work with stakeholders. Next slide, please. But I suppose now, if we didn't get it quite right after our last big calamity, and COVID is now really testing us, I suppose the question is, can we learn from the last few years and get use COVID as an opportunity to get things right? I think one thing, and Jennifer spoke about it so beautifully, one thing we know really matters to us and is hugely important is, and we can all agree on, is that we really, really need public space. I mean, when we talk about the design of cities and design generally, what we're talking about is reaching a value-based consensus. And I think we can all agree that public space matters. It's the last few months have really brought into sharp relief how dependent we are on the quality of public space. Dublin is, when you look at the stats, and very crudely, the stats tell us that Dublin has lots of public space, like parks. But the problem is they happen in big blocks. The amenity we have in Dublin are big blocks of amenity. The problem is the experience of moving between that amenity isn't so great. So we really need to get our ordinary streetscape right. Next slide, please. Another issue is housing. Housing matters hugely. COVID has taught us that. Our ordinary homes, our private spaces are hugely important to us. And I suppose surely we must learn from COVID that the answer isn't to dumb down standards. It's not the smart thing to do. We must actually focus on generosity, and we must focus on new thinking, new ideas, like co-housing, not co-living. Next slide, please. And I suppose just to wrap up, sustainability matters, because ultimately I think the city will survive COVID because it has to survive COVID. Cities are part of the solution to our sustainability challenge. If we live together in cities, we share resources more efficiently, we can move sustainably, we can live sustainably. The IPCC have identified that in their really important report that they issued in 2018, where they said that cities are one of 4 critical global systems that can accelerate climate action. So I'll just leave you there on that note. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks a million, Ali. I have to remind everybody that Slido.com is the place to put questions, and Ali covered within 5 minutes an enormous range there, and I'm sure there'll be many questions from the audience. So it's Slido.com, and there is a code that you need to put in, which is G620. And if you could tell us who your question is aimed at, and that would be very helpful. So we'll move on. We're staying within the local authority area. Our next panelist is Andree Dargan, who is County Architect at Dún Laoghaire Rathdown County Council, where she leads the architecture department. Andree is a member of the Council's management team and the nominated Energy Performance Officer for Dún Laoghaire Rathdown County Council. She is a Fellow of the Royal Institute of the Architects of Ireland and has for many years been a leading advocate for low energy building design and the provision of high quality social housing. So if I can hand the screen over to you, Andree, I will start the stopwatch. Thank you.
Thank you. What do we think about when we think of the suburbs? Is it urban sprawl and traffic jams, or spacious houses with gardens and easy access to the mountains and the coastline? COVID has changed everything overnight. People are now working from home, which has put pressure on local services and amenities, and it has also put pressure on our homes to be adaptable. We have all been discovering our local areas, and COVID has brought a newfound respect for the role that suburbs play in our lives. Are we now looking at the rise of the suburbs and the death of the city centre? We do, however, have challenges in making suburban living more sustainable. COVID has come upon us at a time when we were starting to focus on the mammoth task ahead in the area of climate action. The Dublin local authorities themselves are only directly responsible for 3% of emissions, so collectively we all need to target the remaining 97%. We can't afford to lose sight of this challenge, even at such a difficult time. We need a new vision, and we need plans that communities can get excited about so that they will be implemented. Local authorities are tasked with being an exemplar, so what can we do to show leadership in climate action? We can set ambitious objectives, we can lead by example, we can develop new partnership initiatives, we can be a testbed for innovative solutions and technologies, we can gather data and we can disseminate our learnings. To be a fair city also, we must look after our most vulnerable, and one of the main functions of a local authority is to provide social housing. Dún Laoghaire has an ageing population, and we provide for independent living for as long as possible by building attractive, low-energy, age-friendly homes, and this reduces the burden on the tenant, on the environment, and also on the state. This also encourages downsizing that frees up larger units for other families. Increasing the residential population is the best way to boost the vitality and economic performance of an area. Extra housing can serve more purposes than providing accommodation alone. It can also create a streetscape, and it can turn underutilised urban sites into much-needed sustainable developments and new neighbourhoods. We need compact growth in the suburbs to sustain our local services. We also need buildings of quality. So as a council, we strive to produce high-quality designs that will in time develop into sustainable communities, such as this scheme in Stillorgan, where we hope to build 88 apartments and a library. Another example at a much larger scale is in Shankill, where we, with the Land Development Agency, are developing a community of almost 600 social, affordable and cost rental homes. This is an opportunity to be an exemplar to show how sustainable development can be done at scale. It will be a flagship low-energy development built to the Passive House standard, which will deliver superb energy efficiency as well as high comfort levels and excellent indoor air quality. COVID has presented us with unprecedented challenges in terms of safeguarding public health and safety, ensuring safe and effective mobility and supporting the recovery of our local economy. A new temporary 3.6 kilometre segregated two-way coastal cycleway has been implemented between Blackrock and Sandycove, and this is aimed at facilitating a shift to walking and cycling. The idea of this coastal route has been around for a long time, but it took the emergency that is COVID to bring it to reality. Little spill-out rest areas called pop-up spaces on the cycling route or close to village centres are set out with bicycle stands, bike charging, public seating and vegetation, and they provide opportunities for local businesses and tourism. Apart from making walking and cycling safe, the measures aim to make physical movement enjoyable for all ages and abilities, so we've built it to be as inclusive as possible, and you can see how successful this has been with a diverse range of users. While it is a transport route and not simply for leisure, it is important that emergency measures didn't end up looking unattractive, and you can see the huge value of having had our architects centrally involved in the project. Temporary designs were also developed for reimagined public spaces in the villages. Blackrock was the first town to be adapted, and we have similar projects in Dundrum, Dalkey and Glasgow. Once safety and mobility were accommodated, there was often capacity for expanded pedestrian zones that could support the local economy. Small traders often use their own seating to personalise their area. Placemaking has been worked through into the simple design details. For example, selecting the planting that reflects the local character, such as using herb planting in Glasgow village. Having progressed the coastal mobility route during the summer, we turned our attention to enable safe and active travel to schools. 3 new consolidated routes totalling approximately 20 kilometres in length are aimed at enabling and encouraging increased walking and cycling to schools and for wider use by the general public. The public engagement on this continues until the 23rd of October, so if you have an opinion, please do make a submission. What's significant about this is that for the first time it is interconnecting villages and suburban areas across the county. Ultimately, all of our villages will be connected. The COVID lens has also changed how residential communities want to deal with traffic within their own neighbourhoods, and so we have a Safe and Quiet Streets initiative commencing. This has its roots in a small upgrade we did of a residential street in Dún Laoghaire some years ago. There have been real consequences for COVID, for climate change. And in response to COVID and climate change, or government policy, or driven by community, we have made major changes in mobility and livability over the last 4 months. There have been physical responses and psychological level responses. Change is temporary, but transformation is permanent. And which are we going to have as a result of COVID? We have begun to join the dots. The suburbs have found a new lease of life, and they've thrown off some negative connotations that they may have had. The suburbs have now come into their own, and there's no going back. Thank you.
Thank you, Andree. That was a fascinating whistle-stop tour of Dún Laoghaire, Rathdown and all the exciting projects that are going on there. I'm going to move on swiftly to our next speaker. If I can just remind everybody again that you can ask questions, and it's probably a good idea when they're in your head to put them down during somebody's talk, and use slido.com, so slido.com, and the code is G620. And please tell us who the question is aimed at, because we will probably get quite a number of questions. So if I can move on to the next panelist, we're very lucky to have Liam Herrick with us. Liam is Executive Director of the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, and he has been in that post since November 2016. Prior to that, Liam worked as an advisor to President Michael D. Higgins, and he was Executive Director of the Irish Penal Reform Trust between 2007 and 2014. Liam has also worked as the first head of legislation and policy at the former Irish Human Rights Commission and with the Law Reform Commission and the Department of Foreign Affairs. So if I can hand the screen over to you, Liam, I will start the clock.
Good evening, Philip, and good evening, everybody. I'm delighted to be with you this evening. I've worked in the area of human rights for about 20 years. And whereas COVID is clearly a public health crisis, it's also in many respects a human rights and equality crisis. What we've seen is that the virus has essentially exposed and brought to the surface many structural and profound features of inequality in our society. It's illuminated the situation, very often intolerable, of many sections of our society. It's presented a lot of very urgent and immediate human rights violations that are very much around us in our streets that we can see. And it's also fundamentally altered and changed the relationship between the citizen and the government, and indeed the space in which we live. The next slide, please. I think the first thing we've seen is that some groups in our society have suddenly been exposed as living in intolerable situations. The virus has exposed the profound vulnerability, particularly of people living in congregated settings. So we've seen crises with nursing homes, care settings, prisons, and direct provision. And it's clear that many of these issues were deemed to be serious human rights violations before, but they can no longer be compartmentalised or segregated because they present a challenge very immediately for everyone. In the prison setting, we've had remarkable success, and there was no positive case in the Irish prison system until July. But with nursing homes and direct provisions, we've had very serious crisis, and we see here pictures from the Skellig Star direct provision centre in County Kerry, where there was a very high number of positive cases and profound questions for state responsibility and culpability. So what has COVID resulted for this particular social challenge? I think it's very likely to accelerate the end of direct provision, and I think it's increasing the pressure for government policy in that area. It's also, I think, made irrefutable the case for much more aggressive state oversight, inspection and accountability of all places in which people are congregated and detained. It essentially has made irrefutable the argument for shining a light into our closed spaces. The next slide, please. Also, it's brought to the surface the vulnerability of many individuals that live chaotic and challenging lives in the urban space, and particularly the challenge that's posed by street homelessness and drug use among street homeless people. The Anna Liffey Drug Project and the London School of Economics have conducted a research study of how our homeless services have responded during COVID and the positive achievements that have happened there. I think this is a very exciting example of where the public health crisis has brought issues to the surface, created a sense of urgency, and actually precipitated very, very positive responses. So what we've seen is, in coordination between civil society and the state sector, we've seen an incredibly positive achievement in terms of saving lives during the public health crisis. We've seen methadone, naloxone being made available more quickly, access to harm reduction processes where red tape has been removed. We've seen treatment services for homeless people being opened up and prescriptions being delivered to people in their homes. The result has been lives have been saved, not just among the homeless population themselves, but in terms of the potential risk that they carry for the general population. A huge success. The next slide, please. And then I think moving into the public space as well, we see a change in the relationship between the citizen and the space in which we inhabit. So what we've seen for the first time in peacetime in Ireland is we've seen restrictions, regulation and policing of our movement around the city in which we live. We've seen the police having the powers to question where we work, why we're moving around, and the restriction on the space in which the sphere in which we can orbit, 5 kilometres or 2 kilometres. This is unprecedented. And whereas we've seen a much more moderate approach in this jurisdiction than in some other places, it is something that needs to be very carefully monitored because of the potential long-term impact. The next slide, please. And finally, where this really, I think, shows into sharp relief is how it regulates our capacity to express our political and other beliefs in the public square, in the agora, in the piazza. The right to protest, to express one's political beliefs in a public space is a fundamental feature of democracy, and it's especially important from those that are marginalised from parliamentary systems. Of course, it does present a particular challenge during a public health crisis. And what we've seen in Ireland is a moderate approach where the guards have taken a view that where people are trying to comply with public health guidelines exercising the right to protest, there has been a tolerance. But I would say that we are facing a challenge around that, where some groups now are deliberately trying to confront and provoke violence during some of these protests and deliberately disobey public health advice. So in conclusion, this crisis has made us review our responsibilities to those most vulnerable, but also the way in which we express our political rights in a public space. And this is not going to, I think, ebb away anytime soon. Thanks, Philip, and back to you.
Thanks, Liam. That was absolutely fascinating to see this idea of this COVID lens or COVID prism highlighting existing challenges and injustices that can't be tolerated anymore that we need to address. So we will move on to our final speaker. Again, can I remind you to use slido.com? I said I would be like a broken record. We are delighted to have Sinead Burke join us. Sinead is director and founder of Tilting the Lens. So we bring the lens analogy in there again. Sorry, I must have borrowed that off you, Sinead, which is a consultancy company working to accelerate systemic and cultural change across design and innovation in every business sector. Leveraging her expertise as an educator and disability rights advocate, Sinead supports clients to activate the breadth of business and creative opportunities to be gained by a focus on accessibility and inclusion. Her work facilitates an organization's approach to designing an inclusive future and does not just ask the question, who is not in the room, but constructs pathways to ensure that equity is embedded in the growth trajectory of both the organization and the wider world. So if I can hand the screen over to you, Sinead, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Philip. Thank you. My name is Sinead. I use the pronouns she and her, and I am today coming to you wearing a grey roll neck jumper, a bob length hair that is slightly longer due to the pandemic that is brown. I have brown eyes and I'm sitting in front of a wardrobe. For just 1 second, I want you to think of your favourite place in the city. It might be far away or you haven't visited for some time, but do you know where it is? I do. Can you do everything in that space with independence and with agency? Is there anything that you have to approach somebody and ask for help? Or have you even considered it before? My guess is you can probably do most things with independence. I can't. I am a disabled woman. I have dwarfism. I'm a little person. I stand at the height of 105.5 centimeters tall. I am disabled by design, by the design of our cities, by the design of our culture, by the design of our policies, and the design that we inculcate among each and every one of us. But how did this begin? How did it happen? If we were to take a very quick look through the disability trajectory here in Ireland and in broader countries, we can first look at disability coming through a medical model. Looking at disability only a lens through conditions and labelling that happened within hospitals and clinical spaces. The rhetoric surrounding disability in that time was often disabled people were considered a burden on their families, on their societies, and on their communities. The solution was to remove disabled people from those homes and move them into care centres, where they could be othered further, but their clinical needs at least could be met. We then began to evolve our thinking around inclusion and began relocating those individuals back into the communities. But in the interim, we designed the world without them. We placed emphasis on historic buildings due to their architectural prowess and never considered how a disabled person might need to enter or exit. We created public spaces without thinking about accessible bathrooms. And right now we're in a human rights model, understanding the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities to have agency, dignity, pride, and access. What does that look like within a design framework? What opportunities are there to rebuild a city, thinking about disability and designing for all? I think right now is the perfect opportunity in which we can do that. Living in a global pandemic, there has never been more resources invested in changing how spaces are designed, shaped, and social distanced. But by creating opportunities for social distancing, we're also creating opportunities for access. But as our rhetoric begins to evolve about vulnerabilities, underlying conditions, and a surge to chase the economy back to where it once was, and those who are more vulnerable just remaining within their homes, it echoes and mirrors the past in a way that makes me and many others deeply uncomfortable. So what is the solution? A solution in many ways is thinking about how do we design for disabled people as a whole. Often when we think about cities, we create data sets and science and we analyse what does the majority need. But we're now learning that accommodating for the majority, or those who exist and look like ourselves and think like ourselves, is not the solution that we think or want it is. So instead of designing for the bell curve, why don't we think about those groups who have often been on the verges of society? What are the accommodations that they require in order to be in public spaces and buildings, and design for those? Because investing through that lens will create opportunities and rationale for everyone. A key objective right now is thinking about healthcare, thinking about sanitation. How are we in public spaces thinking about the designing of our bathrooms for people to be able to wash their hands, for people to be able to use the bathroom and to keep safe? That's not something I can access right now, even in the interventions that have been created due to COVID-19. But if public bathrooms are not accessible and available to the disabled, trans, and other marginalised communities, what are we as a city saying? You're welcome here as long as your bladder allows you? Or you're not? Our exclusion may not have been intentional, but by designing spaces in the way in which we have done, people feel the exclusion so tangibly and so emotively. So in thinking about solutions, what is the way forward? What we need to invest in is collaboration, understanding that co-creating and co-designing spaces is not something to be nervous about, but something to embrace. For example, if we're designing a retail space or a coffee shop, are we thinking about accessibility in the lighting? Are we thinking about creating hubs in which are brighter lit for those with visual impairments or low vision, where they can gravitate towards? Or a dimmer corner for those who are autistic or have sensory issues, or families, or those who just need to get a bit of work done, when we're back allowed in places where there are roofs and we can have coffee at our whim. Design is such an incredible opportunity. In order to move forward, we need to think about the universal design principles, but also through a lens of beauty. Thinking about examples like the Guggenheim Museum, which is one of the most accessible, incredible places in the world in New York. It is designed on a ramp where everybody has equity in the way in which they analyse and look through the art, but designed through a principle of accommodating for everyone by thinking of a few individual people. What I would ask those of you who are participating in this session, who are engaging at home in the audience, when you envision a city, as we move through thinking about planning and policy, who are we not including? How can we bring them to the table to leverage their lived experience and their expertise to ensure that as we look forward to what Ireland might look like within the next decade, no one is at home because they weren't designed or included to? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sinead. That was a wonderful description of the need to design for inclusion and to employ co-design and do everything through the lens of beauty. So we're now going to move on to a question and answer session. I know there were 6 presentations there, and thank you to all the panelists for the presentations, and there's a huge amount of work that has gone into them. I did say at the beginning that these would be diverse presentations, they would be interdisciplinary, and that we would hear from 6 perspectives within this enormous, challenging area of COVID in the city and the idea of fairness in the city and what can COVID show us. And certainly through those perspectives, it's very clear that the COVID lens is highlighting many things, but also solutions are being tried out or being implemented, and there are solutions that are possible and could be implemented. And we've gone on a journey from social inclusion, looking at public housing and the need to get the community behind change, to biodiversity, nature-based solutions, and a quiet future, to cities as wicked problems, looking at the importance of public space and housing and sustainability, but also with the idea that cities can survive this current crisis. And then we moved on to the suburbs. We have a new respect for the suburbs and these wonderful inclusive cycle tracks and cycle lanes, and energy efficient housing in Dunleary Rathdown. And then we moved on to human rights, looking at how public space is affected and how we move around public space has been affected by the COVID restrictions. And then we ended up with inclusion, design and universal design and interdependence and agency for all in all spaces. So, as I say, we're not going to be able to have a typical debate. I'm going to try and tease out some points with the participants, with the panel, and I would again remind you that you can add your own questions, and we will be coming to those in a few minutes if you use slido.com. So I'm going to turn first to the Lord Mayor, Councillor Hazel Chu, if that's okay. So, Lord Mayor, I was very interested in what you were talking about and the ideas that are coming out from that we need more social inclusion. And I'm aware that you attended a UN forum for mayors, maybe yesterday, I think. And I was wondering, did social inclusion as a response to increased social inclusion as a response to COVID come up as something that was discussed with those mayors, who I understand came from all over the world, and you presented at this session?
Well, not directly social inclusion, but definitely the idea of affordable housing came up, and the ideas of what do we do with the issue of kind of a livable city came up, because when we talk about social inclusion, when we talk about livable city, kind of the affordable housing and public housing is very key to it, because research shows that migrant cluster in, well, our city in Dublin, in areas or cheap housing, not in ethnic groups like abroad. So you have different mayors saying, well, listen, we have more mixed models, and this is why the Fianna one is good to note that it was a mix of people and proper integration, and the exchanging of ideas with different mayors was really good in that sense, because it came from very different places. You had very diverse models in different cities already, whereas in Dublin, I think we're just starting at that point at the moment.
And the mayors that were there, can I ask, were they elected mayors? Did everybody have the same level of agency within their cities to lead change, or was there a diversity?
Majority were elected, and this is something that I and other mayors in Dublin have actually, because there's 4 mayors in Dublin. There's Fingal, there's South Dublin County Council, and there's Dún Laoghaire, and there's myself, the Lord Mayor in the city itself, and we had all talked about kind of directly elected mayor being an issue, mainly because you do need to give that person the agency, as you say, and the power in so far of making sure that the changes are implemented, and also you have the power to draw policy in the first place. I'm slightly luckier, I guess, in a way, in my role. Previously, the role would have been very ceremonial, but because of COVID and all the ceremony is cancelled, so events have been cancelled, I've moved more into the policy space, which I'm quite used to, and also the kind of project management space of things that we need to do. And I think you need to provide, however, you need to provide the buy-in for that. I have a very good executive at the moment through the City Council who are happy for me to do that. But you should in itself have legislation that puts that on its own footing, and also have it so that the people will publicly put their weight behind it for also a longer term. A year is not enough time to do everything you need to do within a city.
Yes, I was very surprised when I found out it was only a year. I hadn't quite copped that. I hadn't quite realised. So do you think that possibly an elected mayor could be something that is particularly useful in leading change in a crisis like this? Is that, do you, when you look at the other mayors, do you see that has been quite because there's the covenant of mayors for climate change, etc. So that it is a phenomenon at the moment of mayors coming together and figuring out how to get their city through crises.
Absolutely. Like you look at Hidalgo, and that's a perfect example.
Exactly.
And I think if anyone kind of wonders, well, should we have a directly elected mayor and have mayoral powers? Look at her. Look at what she has done for the city and the changes and responses during COVID. And I think that is the best argument to make when it comes to why we need it. Overall, we need local government reform as it is, because I think right now our councillors are being underutilised, and your executive is being stretched. So you need a better balance where the councillors will have more power, and also you have a directly elected mayor that will work with the executive, and things would perhaps be a bit more efficient.
Great. So I apologise, I'm going to have to move on, but thank you for those answers. So just keeping in the order of the presentations, I'm going to move to Jenny McElwain, Professor Jenny McElwain next, if that's possible. And Jenny, obviously approaching a crisis like COVID requires all sorts of skills and perspectives. And so we've heard many diverse perspectives this evening, including your own. And so tonight is essentially an interdisciplinary conversation. And I know that was one of the things that motivated you to take part in the event. And I wondered, could you just explain why interdisciplinarity is so important to you and your work?
Yeah, thank you, Philip. Yeah, I mean, I think Ali really said it. It's cities are a wicked problem, and climate change is a wicked problem. Biodiversity is a wicked problem, and by saying wicked, it means it's so huge, and often discipline-specific, well-meaning groups can develop a solution which has unintended consequences. So, for example, with climate change, we know we have to divest from fossil fuels, we have to move into green energy. There's a big movement towards, let's say, bioenergy. But increasing use of bioenergy has just moved a problem to the tropics, where we're seeing land use change and biodiversity loss. It's good for climate. It is absolutely not good for the tropics. It's not good for the biodiversity of those areas. So I really feel strongly that every board of every company, council, university, it has to be made up of a wide diversity so that at least a quarter of the board feel uncomfortable and they're asking themselves, why am I here? I don't even understand the language these people are using, because they may have kind of a left field insight on the problem and bring, something that's very obvious to them, which may be a solution that absolutely nobody has thought about.
Yeah. Okay, no, those are very strong reasons, and I think in many ways, myself listening to the presentations from so many perspectives, that's happening this evening to an extent. Now, Jenny, I'm going to have to move on because I realise what the time is, so apologies. Can I move on to Ali Grehan now? I'm keeping again in the order. Hi, Ali. I earlier quoted Rowan Moore from The Observer on the implementation of solutions whose time has come. And you were talking about change in the city, and obviously change is really not that easy to push through. It's very challenging. But I was wondering what your thoughts are on how COVID has precipitated all these changes and interventions in the city at this extraordinary speed. Is there anything that we can learn from this that could change how we manage change, if you like?
Yes, I think so. Can you hear me, Philip?
I can hear you perfectly, yeah.
Great. I suppose we learn what we always learn in these situations. We can do astonishing things when we have to. And certainly Andree was talking about all the wonderful initiatives they've done in Dún Laoghaire Rathdown. And similarly, I suppose we've pushed through measures, COVID mobility measures they're called. It's not a lovely term, but they've happened very quickly. And then, of course, in nothing to do with Dublin City Council, but in terms of how we've responded as people to the demands that have been put upon us. These astonishing changes in our behaviour. We're all going around wearing masks now. I mean, that would have been unthinkable at Christmas. We can do astonishing things when we have to. And I suppose what we really got to do is, certainly with things like, if you just at the very basic level, those temporary measures, we do need to make them beautiful. We need to make them permanent. I think we absolutely need to give more space, street space, to pedestrians, to people of all abilities, as Sinead spoke about, and enable people to move around sustainably, and less space to private cars. Private car use is a fantasy built on, this idea that we can all move around on a whim in our private cars and all move down to the countryside and travel around the country in our private cars is a fantasy that is built on cheap oil, and that is on the way out. So, yes, in terms of, I think, my slide, which showed all the policy areas, it is complicated to try and get all of those issues, bring all those issues together. But essentially what we have to ask ourselves is what are we trying to achieve? What is our priority here? And if we can, and that, as I said, goes to the essence of design, is you actually just try and look at the issue that seems to be terribly complicated and try and break it down into the core problem and try and bring some value-based consensus around that, and then start to try and figure out solutions.
Great. And I might actually now, Ali, move over to Andree and ask her a similar question, because obviously there are enormous changes that are needed in terms of climate change in the city. And I'm wondering, in terms of COVID, Andree, do you see any alignment between the changes precipitated by COVID, such as these interventions you showed us into public space, like the cycle lanes and the housing you showed us, and the need to meet the government's and the EU's target of reaching carbon neutrality by 2050?
Yes, I suppose to start, as Ali just said there, COVID has sort of shown us that where there's a will, there's a way. We've made changes recently in our health system and in the public realm that we never thought would be possible. So with COVID, the quality of people's homes has become so important. People, especially the elderly, have been spending a lot of time in their houses, so it's really important that their homes are comfortable and economic to run. Unfortunately, however, many homes in Ireland today aren't that. And to meet carbon neutrality targets as a country, I think we should be embarking on a massive retrofit programme, and that would be the most cost-effective and the most carbon-effective policy. As they say, we just need to think globally but act locally, just exactly as we've done with COVID. It has also been important during COVID for the elderly that they had a sense of security and community, and when they have been kept indoors, and they need some small, maybe outdoor space for exercise. So we try to build this in when we're building schemes for the elderly, as you may have seen from some of the earlier slides that I showed. Also, their accommodation needs change as they get older and less independent. We have, for example, built houses where we have alcoves off the living room that can be cordoned off if they have a carer maybe who has to stay over if their circumstances change. So all these houses mean that people can stay in their houses for longer, and it makes sustainability core to what we do. In relation then to the public space interventions, the numbers of people out walking and cycling during COVID have significantly increased, obviously, in the wake of reduced public transport as well, which went down to about 15 or 20% capacity. And air quality monitoring Dublin shows that there's been a significant reduction in nitrous oxides and fine particulate matter, and these pollutants are obviously primarily linked to the reduction in traffic. So while it's great to see people out using our routes along the coast for a leisurely cycle, and they're even taking their children out to safely teach them how to cycle, to have any long-term impact, it needs to be recognised as actually a transport corridor, and that it provides a viable alternative to driving for commuters. And we know that it's starting to do this already, as the counters we have are showing that the users are spread across all days of the week and not just at the weekend. But it's also important that that network of routes, that we create them across the county, as I was mentioning in our Safe Travel to Schools. And that project is focused on connecting up various sections of existing walking and cycling infrastructure. And just by adding little extra pieces, we can actually interconnect them. And that actually makes it viable then for people to get around the whole county. So all those are areas, I think, where the two link.
Andree, you're using this real-life experiment to measure and make the case for them to stay and be more permanent into the future. If it's okay, I might just move on and with to a similar vein to Liam. And Liam, I was going to ask you, this idea of changes in the long term. So not just these sort of temporary changes in the response to this emergency, but that actually better things can come out of this that last. You mentioned a number of positive things that have happened in the human rights space. What changes have been initiated by COVID that you think there can be no going back on it? We have to move forward and keep this trajectory.
I think on the positive side, I definitely think that the momentum now for abolishing direct provision and having much better oversight and regulation of all congregated settings is going to be irresistible. I think that's very positive. I'm not so confident that those changes about access to services are going to last. Already there's a sign in which services were built around individuals during the crisis because for once their rights impacted on our rights, because of the interdependence that the disease created. That could ebb away, and there's a lot of work to be done to resist that. But I suppose there's also dangers, and I think people become conditioned to accept restrictions on their movement, their freedom, being subjected to surveillance. And there are dangers in any society that a community can become conditioned to accepting these, or in fact even demanding them. And I think we're already seeing a debate at the moment where some people are demanding more restrictions, more punishment of people who transgress public health guidance. And that balance between an impulse towards punishment rather than an impulse towards communication, encouragement and solidarity is something we need to be cautious about. I think we've seen some countries go down the line of exploiting the crisis for repression. That's not happening here now, but the longer this goes on, the more that risk presents itself.
And presumably there could be a tipping point. There is a tipping point when it falls into that danger zone eventually, and you're looking out for the signs of that.
But we need to remember that this is a period of incredible political instability in every country. And we also have other destabilising factors like Brexit and so on too.
Yeah.
So we should never be complacent about our constitutional rights and our civil liberties. And we've seen countries like Hungary and Poland, regress very heavily during this crisis. And obviously we've got the situation in our nearest neighbour and in the United States. So I think this is really a time to be vigilant.
Excellent. Okay, Liam, thank you for that. I do have to move on and again remind people that to put their questions up on Slido. There are many questions up there already, but I'm going to move on to Sinead. And Sinead, if I can keep in the subject area of change and the changes that we've been talking about changes that have been made and we need to keep them going. You were really talking about changes that we need to make now and changes to culture, so quite deep changes. And I wondered, you could make comparisons, I presume, with your work in the fashion industry in terms of how do you change culture in an industry like fashion and then in an industry like the construction industry and the built environment. Do you have any thoughts on that? I'm sure you do.
Absolutely. We'd hope so, but absolutely. I think in terms of changing the culture, it has to be a systemic approach and realize that what we're trying to create is a long-term trajectory that has real tangible change for those who are most invested or most requiring of the change. I think if we were to compare kind of fashion and design, we might lose a few people, but if we think about the various different systems and where change and culture could come about, I think it's those individuals who hold the most power within a city, within a country. How are they ensuring that their policies, that their legislation, that their consultation is being disability proofed? I think we talk a lot about trying to encourage employment. Unemployment among the disabled community is twice the amount of those who are non-disabled. How do we provide opportunities, perhaps through advisory councils, through consulting, to ensure that even though we don't yet have the pathway by which we are bringing a continuous generation of disabled people and disabled experts to these conversations, but at least in the interim, we're making sure that our policies are ensuring that the needs and accommodations for those groups are being met. I think it's also really important within those rooms at that policy level that we are not prioritizing sustainability over accessibility or inclusivity or equity, but realizing that what we're trying to create is a Venn diagram to find what is the most interim point between all of those concepts that can provide a fairer city for everyone. So there's been brilliant suggestions made about pedestrianisation, taking private cars out. But what about if you can't walk very far? Are we ensuring that our public service transport is accessible? Are we perhaps mobilising our buses to move to electric so that we can both deplete the emissions that's in our city, but also ensure that different types of people can walk about and have agency determining of their needs? I think it's also about inculcating and changing the conversations at an earlier stage too. Are our design schools having disabled voices represented, and within those conversations are we developing scholarships and bursaries by which disabled people can enter? And then I think it's about not just forward planning but retrofitting. We talked briefly about historic buildings. Why in Dublin are so many of our cultural spaces inaccessible? Why do we prioritise architecture over people? Yes, a ramp is ugly, but that's because we designed it that way. There is an opportunity right now to rethink the past, the present, and the future. And if we don't begin to create that cultural change at every level soon, what kind of city and society are we creating?
So it's very interesting. I think we're coming back to this idea of interdisciplinarity, that we need all the voices at the table. We need to co-design. We need to co-create. We need to understand one another. And as Jenny said, have voices in there that maybe come from left of field or in an unexpected place. Maybe have that uncomfortable feeling when you're in a meeting of, I'm not sure why I'm in here. It's not really my area, but actually there is something to contribute, and we need to have all voices at the table. So Sinead, I am going to have to move on. Sorry, do you want one last point? Or
no, I was just saying to embrace it with curiosity, to revel in the discomfort, and to kind of go forth with this notion of creation and innovation.
Absolutely. Perfect. Thank you. So I'm very aware of the time. It is now coming up to 10 to 8, I think. So thank you, Sinead. Thank you to all the panelists. We're going to move on now to questions from Slido, and I'm going to ask Natalie if she could identify some questions that are clearly directed to panelists. Natalie, are you there?
Hello. Yes, I
Hi,
am.
Natalie.
Hi, Philip. What a really interesting, brilliant discussion you're having with the panelists. There's loads of questions. I may just ask one to Sinead, just very real quick. This is from Bernadine, and Bernadine wants to know, Sinead, have you seen an increase in organisations and companies doing real accessibility consultations? And Bernadine can picture a disability-led consultation cooperative business. Is that, just adding on to that, is that similar to your tilting the lens? I wonder, and that's for Sinead.
Okay, so Sinead, can I direct that to your screen? If we can, there we are. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Natalie, and thank you for that question. That's what I hope Tilting the Lens as an organisation is going to be about, in terms of led by disabled experiences, to really invoke this systemic change across various different industries. I think there is an appetite and an aptitude for this work at the moment, particularly in referencing COVID-19 and the various design changes that are required. But I think what we really need to step forth into is not just thinking about accessibility as something that is purely legislative, that is a checklist at the end of a project, but actually using this disability lens as a way to think about innovation, creativity, profitability, opportunity, and community engagement from the very beginning. So using this as a starting point rather than a finishing point and a denouement. We're not just there yet with industry as a whole, but thankfully that probably still means I have a job.
Excellent. And then Bernadine has imagined your consultancy, so you're obviously in the right space there, Sinead.
She's doing my marketing for me.
Absolutely. There you are. Can we go? We should go back to another question to Natalie.
Yeah, I have another question. This is for Ali, and I'm just going to merge two questions into one. It's around co-housing. Aoife Rickard says, how is co-housing defined? And Emma Glees was wondering, I agree that co-housing is a model that should be encouraged and not co-living, but I would be very interested in hearing Ali's reasons for her view. That's for Ali.
Okay, so can I pass that to you, Ali? I'm glad I'm not having to explain on the spot all the different types of co-housing, but I'm sure you are well able to provide that. So if you go ahead, please.
Okay, and just before I answer that, I just want to pick up on what Sinead said. Sinead is so right. Architecture is not an end in itself; it's a means to an end, and so architecture has to be compassionate. It has to fulfil the needs of the people who need to use the spaces and the buildings, and anything else is just not architecture. But and actually, that does link to that question about what's the difference between co-housing and co-living. I suppose co-housing is about a design-led approach to housing where people come together. So a group of people come together to plan and design their homes. And in the process of doing that, they start to create community. And it's a more durable community they create. So that's I suppose, at one end of the spectrum. Co-living, and I'm not saying there isn't a place for it in a modest way, but it isn't the solution. It isn't a blanket solution, because co-living is it's a kind of a one very small size fits all type solution, and it's just the actual co-living end product is the solution, and the people have to try and fit into it. And so by its very nature, I suppose it can only be temporary. And so, of course, there is some place for it in a city where you've got lots of diversity, but it's not a solution. Co-housing would be a more durable solution. And I use that reference because the nature of this kind of debate is it's sound bites, and I wanted to just compare and contrast the two. Housing represents, there's a spectrum of ideas that constitute what is creating homes for people, and we have to explore all of them.
there was a commentary online from Naomi Klein, actually, that I read today, funnily enough, where she was putting co-housing forward as a much more resilient model of housing for situations like COVID, whenever people are having to self-isolate. So we're all retreating to our apartments and houses, but actually if you're in a co-housing development, the community supports one another, so that there's somebody can help look after multiple children. They create this bigger bubble, etc. So she was advocating it as a resilient model for a crisis like this.
Well, me and Naomi Klein then.
Absolutely. I mean, there's so many similarities, you know. We could talk about that for a long time. Okay. Will we go back to Natalie for another question? I think we can take maybe one or two more questions.
Just one or two more. Okay, I've got one for Hazel, our Lord Mayor. Hazel, do you think there are 4 Lord Mayors in Dublin? Does that promote a fair city having 4?
Okay, Hazel. So, or Lord Mayor, we go back to the issue of governance and how it's all set up at the moment. What would your response be?
Whether it's fair or not, well, right now they all represent people of Dublin and they represent them well. I know them actually, each of them, and they work very hard. It goes back to the question of what do we want in terms of governance, and what do we want in terms of local government reform. And for me, it would be very simple. We need to reform the system. We need to have a better governance structure that will have decision-making power that's effective and also efficient. Because to Ali's point about COVID measures, that's been quick. We should be quick. Even without COVID, it shouldn't take us that long to make a city a fairer place, a better place. And it shouldn't take us long and have so much red tape when it comes to making things fair overall or equipped for all, as Sinead pointed to. So for me, should we have 1? Should we have 4? It doesn't really matter as long as they are directly elected and have the powers for it.
Okay, thank you. So it's coming back to that point of electoral local government reform. Will we go back to Natalie for one final question, Natalie?
Yeah, I'm ready. Can we go for? I'd like to ask 2 more questions. One to Andree, one to Liam, if that's okay. It might mean we have to go over by a couple of minutes, but there's some really good questions here, Philip. Just this one's from Anne Walsh to Andree. Can the temporary cycle path and improvements to the villages in Dún Laoghaire be made permanent? How long is temporary if it improves quality of life?
Okay, so that's for you, Andree, on those wonderful cycle paths along the seafront, and there's more in the pipeline as you were showing.
Yes, so I suppose we have put them in place as a temporary measure because with COVID, it all had to happen quite fast, and there wasn't the opportunity to do the normal consultation that you would do if you were putting in a cycleway, which we would typically do, because people can be nervous of change, obviously. But this emergency meant we got straight in there. But now that they're in position, they are actually a test bed for people to really see the impact, and they'll be able to make an informed decision. And we are hoping they'll be bedded after the trial. But there's very little evidence at the moment on mobility interventions in Ireland. And what we're doing is we've engaged Technical University Dublin, their Transport Engineering and Environmental Planning section, and they're going to undertake an independent evaluation and review of our COVID-related public realm measures, and they will make recommendations for the future of the projects, including any ongoing monitoring and evaluation. So they are going to do it in 2 phases. The first phase is going to be to do the Blackrock and the coastal mobility route, and then the other will do the other villages that we've done and towns, Dundrum, Dalkey, Glasstool, etc. So it's estimated that evaluation review will take approximately 3 to 6 months to assess and complete, with an outline framework of sort of January 2021 for the completion of phase 1. So I suppose when that happens, we'll see what the recommendations are. They will examine the traffic, the mobility, the socio-economic impacts of the interventions by doing audits and observational studies and surveys, etc. So we're very hopeful of what will come out of it, but we will see. it will really be up to what people have to say, and that's why we would encourage people, if they want these places to be kept, because obviously there are differences of opinions. They don't suit everybody. Some people feel they're being inconvenienced, etc. But like this and the other routes around the schools, we are looking for people to engage while we're out at the moment on the schools one until the 23rd of October.
So really, COVID has given you the most unexpected, bizarre opportunity to do a one-to-one scale experiment, which you can now assess in real life and in real time. Okay, thank you for that answer. I think it should answer the question, Anne's question, very well. Natalie, you had one more question. You're restricted to one.
Yeah. It's okay. I just want to get this one in for Liam. Liam, this is from Karen, and she'd like to know, how do we ensure that measures brought in during a pandemic that could potentially undermine our right to privacy and data protection are not normalised?
Okay, so Liam, did you get that? So it's, how do we ensure that measures brought in during a pandemic that could potentially undermine our right to privacy and data protection are not normalised?
I think vigilance, as I said before, and I think also, making sure that we don't abandon democratic accountability. The COVID Tracker app is a very good example of this, where actually, despite the pressure to introduce it very quickly, because of the intervention of kind of privacy rights groups like ourselves, the HSE actually put in place a lot of very strong safeguards. And that's really assisted them because it helped to get public support and public buy-in. And the Irish tracing app is now seen as one of the better models internationally. But I mean, there is a real fight to secure parliamentary oversight and independent oversight of public health measures at the moment. They won't happen by themselves because governments are in such a hurry that they're likely to cut corners. So I think it's just constantly making the case for oversight and accountability in all realms. And I think also, the struggle for environmental rights and human rights at the moment are very much coalescing, because we're seeing now the interdependence of human rights rhetoric and campaigning with environmental rights campaigning. Public health is just one area, but obviously climate justice is another one, where the interests of the environment and the interests of the people are so much coalescing. And I think that that's been a positive trend as well.
So that's a form of complementarity within disciplines and within areas of interest. Okay, Liam, thanks very much. I'm very conscious, and I apologise for going over. That's my poor time management skills. So I think it is time for me to wrap up proceedings. Thank you for joining us and for your insightful questions. I think Slido worked reasonably well there. We got a lot of questions in, and unfortunately we obviously had to make a choice as to which questions to look at. I'd like to say a big thank you to our panellists, the Lord Mayor, Hazel Chu, Sinead Burke, Ali Grehan, Andree, Dargan, Jenny McElwain and Liam Herrick. Just a reminder that this debate has been recorded, so if you want to watch it all again, please feel free, but you won't be able to do that until after 6 p.m. on Saturday. This is the first event of Open House Dublin, so I would urge you to enjoy the festival over this coming weekend. Details are on the openhousedublin.com website. There's an amazing programme. It includes special commissioned films for 2020, which includes Pritzker Prize winners Shelley McNamara and Yvonne Farrell, McCullum Mulvin, social housing projects in Dunleary Rathdown and in Dublin City Council, and a BMX park in Ballyfermot. These premiere online tomorrow at 6 o'clock, so please tune into that. And they will actually be projected in Meeting House Square as well from 6 to 9 on Friday and Saturday evenings. There are also virtual tours, walking tours, self-guided tours. I understand the self-guided tour. There's a cycle tour that's self-guided on exemplar housing by Kieran Cuff, MEP, and there's also a junior Zoom workshop and competitions. Before we end, I would like to thank the IAF team for all their work in setting up the whole Open House Open House Dublin Festival, and also this evening. There's an enormous amount of work goes into it and to the production of the online facility. So I'd like to thank Natalie, Karen, Gillian, Elva, Blohin and Anne-Marie, and also to the IAF board and sponsors. So finally, thank you for your attendance. Thank you for taking part in tonight's discussion. I hope you find it interesting and certainly diverse and interdisciplinary and hopefully thought-provoking. So I'll say good night and stay safe. Thank you.